Hey everyone, I'm going to be conducting this reasonably short video that goes over just the very basics of setting up projectiles. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is bring in a file that I'm going to make available to you, which is this smoke file, and it is, let me just open it up. It looks like this. And so, as you can see, it's not a single texture that has one giant image. It's still a single texture, but this texture contains a bunch of different frames of animation on it. And what we're going to be doing is taking this and slicing it up. So we're going to be taking this one image, chopping it up into all these individual images, and we're going to play them together in a sequence. Now, this particular file was created using a program like Houdini or something like that that allows for you to generate smoke simulations or just other things that are kind of really hard to draw and simulate without doing it offline in some sort of a program that specializes in doing fluids and particulates and things of that sort. Then after the simulation is structured, and if we have time in this class, we'll go over the process of how something like this is created. But basically what it does is you point the camera at a smoke sim, you give it an idea of which parts of the smoke you want it to actually render, and then you let it cook out a render. And part of the parameters of the render that you're cooking out is how many frames you want for it to create so that it knows how to generate a texture sheet that looks like this. There's some downsides to generating smoke in this way. One is that it doesn't look very stylized, so if you're trying to build realistic looking smoke, this is kind of hands down the best way to do it. But if you're planning on doing some other sort of an effect where it looks like it's hand painted, you may want to use something like this as a guide or something that you can paint on top of to just get an idea of what your shapes are looking like, and just kind of to guide you a little bit. But yeah, using these programs, usually you'll get some pretty realistic looking smoke, and they tend to fall flat when it comes to generating stylized looking stuff. All right, so with this texture, I'm going to go ahead and just import it into the project, and we're going to create a new particle system. And these particle systems, they always look bad when we first create them. I'm going to go into adjust its position to 0, 0, 0. And what I've done in this scene already, it's the only thing I've done in this scene, is I've gone and changed the camera so that it is drawing solid color on black. And the reason I'm doing that is just so that I can kind of see what it is that I'm doing. A lot of VFX artists will tell you that this is like a no-no, and I actually agree. But the thing is that I don't currently, a lot of times when you're building VFX for a game, there's a lot of stuff in the game that's already done. So you have some environments, you have some idea of what tonality and color levels you have existing already, and so it makes a lot of sense for you to build your effects in an environment that already exists. And that just kind of makes sense, right? You want for your effects to look good in the environment that they're going to be in. And maybe you have multiple environments, that's even better. Now you can test your effect and make sure that it looks good in the myriad of environments that you have at your disposal. But for us, we're just kind of doing a lot of blank slate type stuff. So for clarity's sake, just to make sure I'm getting shapes right and things like that, I usually like to just go and build them with a black background. But the reason why that's bad is that if you'll see that if you change this color to something like a mid-tone gray, that a lot of our details sort of get washed out here. And this mid-tone gray is actually much closer to what you should probably be ultimately optimizing for. Because you're going to have an environment that's not going to be completely black. It's probably not going to be completely white, right? It's going to have a lot of values that will probably average out to something like a mid-tone gray like this. But again, when I start my process, I'm mostly concerned with shapes, and I can see shapes the cleanest whenever I have this black background. So that's why I set it up that way. Although normally speaking, If I'm not just kind of building effects in a background, I'll have some sort of like an environment or a diorama setup where I can build and tune to that. All right, so let's work on making this particle system look like smoke. By the way, our goal today is to create a basic arcane, so purpley, magical projectile. Think like a magic missile or something along those lines. So the first thing I'm going to do is I need to create a material. So I'll just generate a material, and I'm just going to call this my smoke. This actually isn't going to really be smoke per se. It's actually going to, I don't know, be sort of like fairy dust or just some ethereal dust. Just it's gonna look and behave like smoke, but it's gonna be purpley, and for the sake of the flavor of what we're building, it's not smoke. So I'm going to change the shader type over to a particle additive, which basically is me saying I want it to glow. And I'm going to drag and drop that texture into the texture slot of that material, like so. Don't worry about color or anything like that on the material. We're going to be controlling most of that stuff in the particle system. So we'll go to the particle system, and let's go down to the renderer, and you can see that it's currently using that ugly default particle. Let's go ahead and drag and drop our new material, which is called smoke, into that slot. And it's going to look like even worse. And the reason for that is that what it's doing is it's taking that texture that's attached to that material and it's just rendering that outright, because it doesn't know that what we've provided it is a texture sheet or something that's atlased. So in order to tell it that what we've just done is provided a texture sheet, we need to go over here into the texture sheet animation part and just click the checkbox there and expand it. And we don't need to do a whole lot of stuff here, but what we do need to change is the tiling. So it's currently set to 1 and 1. This texture sheet is set up in an 8x8 grid, so we'll just type in 8 and 8. And if you look, you can actually see that it's already playing the animation, because it knows that what its job is to do is to play these images one sequence after the next. You're given animation curves and stuff like that, so you can actually adjust the speed at which some of this atlasing or this flipping happens, where you're basically able to control the rate at which you want it to transition into the next image. So you can see that animation is playing, but it still looks really dumb. So let's make some more improvements. Let's go up to the very top of the particle system and make some changes here. So the current lifetime of these particles is 5 seconds, which is really long. I'm going to change that to maybe something like 1. And you can see that already this is doing wonders for us as far as animation is concerned. It looks much more realistic. So you can kind of, I don't know, they almost look like popcorn kernels that are evaporating. So they just kind of pop and appear in existence. And then they dissipate over time. And that's kind of why we wanted to use a nice texture sheet for this. So let me just go open up that texture sheet again. If you're trying to change the shape of your images over time, that's really hard to do, especially if you just have a still image. If you just have a still image, the particle system itself is capable of fading in and fading out. It can change color over time. But by default, what it can't do is kind of warp, change the shape, or do anything like what you're seeing here. This is the kind of animation that requires frame by frame changes. And this is why we call these like a flip book, right? Because when you have an image, there's only so much you can do to sort of manipulate it until you get to the point where you're like, well, the thing I'm trying to turn it into is actually a completely different image, and I'm trying to set up a series of these images. And so at that time, switching over to this technique, which is called a flip book, makes a lot more sense. There's a lot of challenges associated with building flipbooks because drawing a bunch of pictures sucks, and drawing things frame by frame is time consuming. But it's sort of the only way to have absolute control over how your object appears over time on a frame-to-frame basis. There's all sorts of really great techniques that you can use to try to avoid building flipbooks, but you'll never get this level of control. A lot of the VFX in Overwatch are flipbook based. Another big challenge with flipbooks is that they're really expensive. In order to have a compelling looking flipbook, you need to have a really big picture, because basically that big picture stores inside of it a bunch of smaller pictures. And so usually the size has to be larger than your average texture would be. And there's also a slight processing overhead that's involved as well, because your particle system needs to now control the flipping between these different frames of the animation throughout the life of each individual particle. So you know, the TLDR is, yes, you get all sorts of really great control, but they require usually a lot of additional work, and there's sizable overhead that's involved. But sometimes you just can't avoid it. Smoke is one of those examples where oftentimes it's best done using a flipbook. Okay, so let's go back to see what our simulation's currently doing. So this still doesn't look that great, and it's probably because these particles are so small. So let's go ahead and change their size. I'm going to change the starting size to something like maybe like 5. And already that's starting to look a lot more like fire. That might be a little bit large, so we'll have to make some adjustments there. But the point is that we're making good progress. Cool. So let's go ahead and now turn our attention to the color. I'm going to enable color over lifetime. And I'm going to do a couple of those tricks I showed last time, where I'm going to start the alpha at 0, which gets a much smoother fade in. The fade out on this isn't so important, mostly because the animation itself actually handles a lot of actually pretty much all of the fade out. At the very end here, you can see I don't really have a frame that is kind of in one step or two steps past this last frame. And so for that case, I might want to consider going into the gradient editor here, adding in a final frame that puts it at an alpha of 0. And then what I can do is in the middle here, roughly the middle, oops, that's not the middle. In the middle here, go ahead and set this to, I don't know, maybe 100. And then I'll create another little alpha controller right here, maybe at like the 95% mark. And yeah, that's probably good. Maybe just adjust this a touch. What did I make this one? This guy's 100. I'll change this one up to like maybe, I don't know, 80 or something. 50. Yeah, that looks smooth. Ultimately, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to have a smooth in and a smooth out. I don't want any of that that abrupt sort of popping that you get usually when you just have a particle exist and then not exist, right? It's either it's on or it's off. I'm trying to get some really nice gradation going on here so that it smoothly fades in and smoothly fades out, so it looks just a little bit more realistic and a little bit more appealing to the eye. I can always adjust this later on, but I'm more or less happy with the current state that it's in. Let's go ahead and apply some color. So the colors are these bottom dudes here. So let me go ahead and change these around. So get that first color to kind of a magenta. And trying to figure out if I want it to kind of start white and then turn purple, or if I want to go the other way around with it. I kind of feel like maybe starting white and then going purple is going to be the sort of the way to go here. I think that looks pretty okay. I can't stress enough that the working sort of overall is really the way to go here. Like, don't don't spend all your time trying to get this smoke to look great, because remember, it needs to look great with everything else. So once you just get it to the point where it looks good enough, it just looks meh, then go ahead and move on to the next piece. Don't linger too much, because it's layers. It's really ultimately the layers that are going to make this thing look really good. All right, so I'm going to build another particle system. And so sometimes what I'll do is I'll duplicate a particle system because it'll save me time, and then other times I won't. It just depends on how similar the particle systems are. In this case, I'm just going to build a completely brand new particle system from scratch. So create, and let's go get us a new particle system. I'm going to go ahead and set its position to 0, 0, 0. And it looks ugly, and that's okay. For this guy, we're going to go ahead and crack open Photoshop. So we're going to be kind of creating little fairy particles for this, just like little dusts. And so let's go ahead and generate a new image. All these settings are fine. You know, later on you should care about your width and your height and your resolution, and we'll talk about all that stuff later, but like legit, I don't care about any of that stuff right now. I'm gonna set the background to black, just because, you know, everything that we build that uses the additive shader does not use black color information. So we'll go ahead and create just a new layer. And so I'm gonna go ahead and go with, you know, sort of like a purple that I'm going for. I think that looks okay, but I might want to, you know, take it up into like the pink range a little bit more. I think it's a little bit better. Because these arcane abilities, they tend to be kind of almost obnoxiously, like unicorns would just love these the colors that are in this sort of range. So I want to make sure that, you know, I don't dip too deep purple. Once you go too deep in the purple, like too deep in the purples, it starts to look like void warlocky type stuff. I'm going for something that's a little bit more light and airy. And so that's nice and obnoxious. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'll just go ahead and crank up my brush size. So I'm going to maybe set this to something like half of the size of the actual image itself. You want to make sure that when you're building out these textures that you're careful, like that you don't have any pixel information being written to the edges, because that will make it really obvious. Like you'll actually be able to see those pretty easy, even though you can't really maybe see them in Photoshop. You'll be able to see them pretty easily inside of Unity. They'll look like they were painted on squares. So just make sure that you stay away from the edges, because that sort of a thing will be exacerbated. Like right here, even though, you know, it might not look like it, this will create some pretty hard lines up at the top and on the side over here. So just be careful. So I'm gonna go ahead and roughly place this more or less in the center here. Don't have to be perfect. So up there. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna go ahead and place another one of these slightly smaller, like 300. And I'll go ahead and pop another one right here, just sort of like in the center, just to create a nice little pixie dust sort of like glow. And that's it. Let's go ahead and save it. So I'm just going to call this dust particle and save that out. And go ahead and import that file. Create a new material. Call it dust. Set it to particle additive. Drag and drop. Go to our new particle system. We should really name these. So this will just be my dust. And I'll call this other one smoke. And let's change the renderer on this so that it is now using our new dust. And it'll instantly look like way, way better. So this gives us a good place to start. All right, so the lifespan is a little bit too long, so let's change this to maybe something like 2. Let's do our little color over lifetime trick so that they are fading in and out. I also think that they're a little bit big, so currently their starting size is 1. Maybe change it to 0.1. Maybe that's too small. 0.2. It's a little bit better. All right, let's go ahead and hit play and kind of see how things are working together. All right, not too bad. And because I said not too bad, that means we're going to move on to the next thing. So what we're sort of building here are the different components to any projectile. So this smoke that we're creating sort of represents what you might consider a trail. And it doesn't look like a trail right now because it's all emanating from the same place. But this is supposed to create like some kind of drag so that as a projectile is moving, imagine if a projectile is moving downwards, right? The idea is that as these smoke particles are being created, they're kind of lingering behind. The same thing goes for like these little dust dudes. They're kind of almost acting like embers and stuff like that. And this is ultimately to create a heightened sense of directionality. So as these elements are being left behind and maybe even being thrusted backwards, the idea is that they are showing very, very clearly what direction this particle or this projectile is moving in, which is really important. Regardless of the game that you're playing, you want to usually know where a projectile is going, whether you fired it or it's being fired at you. The next thing we want to worry about is what we actually just call the hot spot. And so the hot spot is it's the business end of the projectile. It's the thing that is threatening to hurt you, to wreck your face, and usually should be avoided. A couple of things that we can do in order to create this, and this is where there's a little bit of decision making that has to happen. So one of the things that you could do, by the way, there's a ton of options here, but I'm just going to kind of be walking through the thought process. So one of the things that you could do is go and just create another particle system. So you might say, hey, I kind of like the direction that these dust particles are going. Let me duplicate this dust. So it's Control D to duplicate. So now I have another one of these. And then you might just go and say, I'm going to change the starting size of these to like something like, I don't know, big. And then the lifespan, I don't know, I'm not going to mess with it yet. Starting size, I just changed that. What do I want to change? Where is it? Speed, here we go. You want like the speed to maybe be like nothing, so that, and that already looks kind of cool. It's kind of like a blobby. Go ahead and move this like down like here. Change the shape. So right now, they're all sort of being emitted in this radius of 1. Change that to maybe like 0.2 so that it's, hovering a little bit tighter to the center. Go and change the color over lifetime, or maybe just change the number of particles we're emitting. I got 10, like 5, 2, yeah, I don't know. Just depends on kind of how intense I want that to be. And so you see, like what I'm ultimately doing is I'm trying to create some sort of like a central shape, the thing that maybe the player should be definitely watching out for. The trick that you run into though is that if you use a particle system for this, is that particles are really good at moving. Particles aren't really good at sort of creating hard lines and very distinct shapes. They're really good for kind of filling in space and for simulating amorphous things, which is why they're so good for these little pixie dust things, and they're so good for like smoke and that all that sort of jazz, right? And so the trick that we run into, let me take this guy and move him like up there. The trick that we run into is that oftentimes whenever like you're dealing with projectiles, you really want for that to be sort of like the hard constant of as far as shape language is concerned, right? You want very clear lines that dictate or that visually show when when something is intersecting with you, when it's going to cause damage. And it, think about any game that you've played where you swear you didn't get hit by that projectile. You swear that you dodged it in time, right? And so, when you look at this, it's like, okay, well, I guess that white part to me is reading as the hottest part, the most dangerous part of this effect. So why is it moving around so erratically? And if sometimes when that white spot gets way back here towards the end, it almost makes this bottom part right here look safer. And so, you're going to kind of be looking at this white spot saying that's what I should be dodging. When, in reality, the problem is that that's constantly fluctuating. It's not set in stone. So could you go and solidify that a bunch? Like, you totally could. Like, if you were to, for instance, come in here and change the radius of this to like 0, that'll do a lot to just sort of like tighten things up a lot. This is currently being emitted as like a cone. So, we could go ahead and like change this to like a sphere, clamp that down, like the radius down to like 0. And then we can go ahead and like change like the randomization value of the, like, we could go and change all of these values so that it's essentially emitting at a single point and it is not moving like whatsoever. Remove all force from it, what have you. That looks kind of cool. It actually looks like super cool. But the problem is that when we're dealing with these projectiles, we usually want it to be just a little bit more straightforward and obvious where the painful part of the projectile is. Now, this is kind of interesting to look at. So, like you've seen me in the past, whenever I think that there might be something cool or salvageable, I'll go ahead and just kind of disable it and tuck it away for later. But for now, let's explore going back into Photoshop. Let's try and manipulate this shape a little bit to see if we can create something that is going to be interesting enough for us to use maybe as the head of a projectile. Now, this shape currently has no directionality. So who knows where it's pointing? I don't. So what we can do is we can go in and maybe add in some extra information, just like some extra brush strokes at one end, just to make this read as being hotter at the top and cooler at the bottom. And so now we've sort of created this much more of a sense of directionality. So where the other shape was, completely circular, it was 100% radial, there really was no telling which direction it was facing. With this, it's a little bit more obvious, like because the wider part is pointing up, this will read as being the most dangerous part of the ability, and that's kind of what we want. We could even exaggerate this a little bit more by going and extending out this tail if we wanted to, and maybe we'll end up doing that. Who knows? It's just all about experimentation at this stage. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. Actually, I should save as. My bad. So this is going to be the arcane projectile. It's going to be the head of the projectile, so it's okay for him to have a name like that. And we'll drag and drop that image in. And for this, I'm going to go ahead and create a game object, 3D object, and we're going to be using a quad. So a quad, in VFX we tend to call these cards. Name is kind of obvious. It looks like a floating card. Let's go ahead and create a new material, just as we've done in the past. So material, call this projectile head. Change that H to a capital H. And let's go once again, change this to additive type particle shader, and then drag and drop the arcane projectile there. And then we'll take that new material and attach it to this quad. Like so. Whoops, I missed. Move the quad down. Projectile head. There we go. I'm gonna go ahead and tap R and scale this dude up. And currently, you can see that it's sort of like facing like upwards, and that's okay. I haven't really sort of decided which direction this thing is going to be heading in. My gut tells me that I'm going to have it moving in sort of like the right direction. So moving like that a ways, and then I'm going to have like all these particles like streaming outward. But we'll see how it goes. Who knows? Now I know that what I'm going to be constructing is going to have some post-process, and so I'm going to go ahead and take my main camera and attach to it our post-process behavior, and I'm just going to generate a real quick post-processing profile just to get some bloom in there. So this will just be our arcane test. It's really nice that you can just build these profiles on the fly like that, so you can tailor them to whatever your testing needs are at the moment. We'll go ahead and turn on bloom. And then we can go and adjust the intensity however we see fit. But this is really going to help us establish like a hotter glow if that's what we want. It's also going to give us like the ability to just, sort of like adjust how blown out we want this to be, and just how hot we want some of these things to look. And we can adjust accordingly. So I don't want to fiddle with this too much right now. You can see that that's like super intense, but you know, we'll mess around with it. I just want to kind of have it there and active. Eventually I want to tune this so that this maybe isn't anywhere near as hot it is, but you see how the bloom does great things to the smoke, and it does even better things when it comes to catching these little individual dust particles, giving them that nice little glow. So eventually once I start to get everything more or less in place, I'm gonna want to fine tune the bloom so that I catch things the right way. So that, you know, this dude right here, the main head of the projectile, so that he's not as over the top intense as he is right here, but that I still get sort of that nice cool pixie dust glow on these little guys. So yeah, just something to think about. Okay, so I think I'm ready to start to turn this thing into an actual projectile now. So let's go ahead and get started with that. I'm going to set this up so that the projectile just moves from left to right. I could set this up with an animation curve using the Unity's built-in animation system, but I won't do that because projectiles don't work that way. A projectile needs to continue to move in a direction until it hits something, so it doesn't just play an animation from start to finish. It needs to travel a defined distance, but if it hits anything along the way, it needs to be smart enough to know that it made contact with something. And so anytime that we have decision making or logic or something like that we have to take into account, that means that programming is going to be involved. So let's go ahead and get that piece figured out. So let me do a real quick bit of assembly. So this is just going to be, let's call it the head of the projectile. I'm going to double click on the head, and I'm going to create an empty game object. This is a technique similar to the ribbons that we created previously. So I'm going to have a base object that's going to have all of these other objects as its children. So I'm just going to go and create, I'm just going to call this my arcane projectile. And all these things I've made, the smoke, the dust, and the head of the projectile are all now going to be children of this arcane projectile. Super cool. Still got a lot of work to go. Okay, so let's go ahead and get our scripting ready. So let's go ahead and create a C# script. I'm just going to call this my projectile script because pretty much every projectile is going to be able to use it and run the same way. So we'll open that up. And while that's loading, I'm going to go ahead and pause the video real quick, and I'll be right back. Okay, so here we are in the projectile script. And so you can go ahead and I'm just going to take all of these opening curly brackets down to the next line so that's just cleaner to read. It's just something I always do. All right, so on update, which this is, as we handled previously with our constant rotation, since we want this object to be constantly moving forward, we're going to want to be using more of the functionality afforded from the update function. And so here, I want to manipulate the game object that this script is attached to. I want to edit its transform because the transform component is what's responsible for its position, rotation, and scale. I want to edit its position because I'm trying to make it move. And lastly, I want to translate it, which is actually the technical term for the type of movement that we're going to be using. Now, not quite done. I need to tell it how I want it to move. So I want it to translate by moving in a particular direction that I'm going to provide it. So up here at the top, I'm going to provide it with a direction. So I'll type in public vector 3, and I'm going to call this direction, which I'll initialize to nothing. And then I know that I'm going to want to be providing it with a value for speed. And so in here, I'm just going to be I'm going to be providing it with the direction times speed times time dot delta time. The TLDR on what time delta time means is this is basically saying per second. So I want it to move in this direction at a speed of this many meters per second is what this whole mathematical statement means right here. So let's go ahead and save and minimize. And let me attach that script to my arcane projectile. And I save it. I did. Let me troubleshoot why I'm not getting those exposed variables here like I should be. Give me 1 second. Okay, that was weird. So I guess for some reason Unity had a heart attack, so I just needed to restart it, and then I got the exposed variables I was looking for so that I can control the direction and the speed. So if you press play, you should get a whole lot of nothing. If you provide a direction of 1, it will move to the right. If you provide a direction on Y of, let's say, 1, it will move up. And if you provide a direction of 1 on Z, it will move in the Z direction. So we'll play around more with those values later, but let's say that I just want to optimize my projectile so that let me push it away from the camera, move it off screen, and I'm going to set its X to 1. Don't change these values to be more than 1 or less than -1. Keep them within the range of -1 and 1. And use the speed to ultimately kind of factor in how fast you want it to go. So I'll press play. And then there's our projectile moving across the screen. Kind of slow. Crank that up to maybe like 50. Maybe too fast. Unity always has this like starting hiccup where it's kind of loading everything. So you may need to like back it up a little bit just so that you're able to see the entire projectile traverse the screen from one end to the other. You can even see it over here, like watch when I hit play, it like chugs ahead and then it smooths out. Alright, so let's go ahead and make some adjustments. So obviously the smoke of the projectile is pointing the wrong way, as are all of the little pixie dust dudes. So let's go ahead and adjust those. So let me double click on our smoke to take us over to it. So here it is. And so I'm going to take this and rotate it. So I'll just press E and I'll rotate it along the Y-axis. If you hold down Control, that will allow you to snap. So snap it roughly and then just hard set it to 90 degrees. And then let me just align this object a little bit better. Just so that it looks good. The additive shading does a lot of like work here. You can see that kind of what it's enabling or allowing is for like these like smoke particles to sort of blend in with that arcane with the head of this ability, and they're kind of creating some sort of extra motion, because like if you look, the ability itself, the actual head of it, is kind of lame, right? It's not actually moving, but when you get these additive properties going, it can really start to look like it's actually moving, because now what we're doing is, with all of that nice particulate internal motion that we get going from all of those smoke particles, it really starts to get hot and it really starts to look like it's alive and moving. So let's go ahead and press play and see how this looks so we can adjust it. Not too bad. Let me do the same thing with our dust. Our dust is also facing the wrong direction, so let's go ahead and point that back and place it more or less here, and let's go ahead and hit play again and see where we're at. Alright, so looking good. I want to make some adjustments to the smoke because I feel like that's currently the weakest part of the ability. There's actually a lot that's really weak about the ability. So have you guys maybe noticed that it looks...
Sorry, I don't know.
Go away, Alexa. It looks strange. Look at the smoke and look at those dust particles. What you may notice is that those, usually if you're holding a smoldering torch, right, you're moving the torch back and forth, the flames, they linger behind where the torch is moving, and the smoke from the flames linger behind the flames themselves. And so if I were to take this whole ability, so here's the whole ability, and move it around, see how weird that looks? Usually if you move the fire, if I move a torch, the flames don't move so precisely with it. Right, it's like each individual flame, if you will, is kind of instantiated or just kind of pops out, but then it has a life of its own, right? Same thing with smoke. If you move the source of smoke, the smoke doesn't go following it. It just changes the position from which that smoke is emanating. So this is strange. Now, this is easy to fix. So if we go to our smoke, you'll see that currently it is set to, hang on, oh here, its simulation space is currently set to local. Change this to world. So that one change alone makes it so that as you move, each one of the individual particles no longer is a child of the object that it was created from. So even though we're moving this particle system, these particles don't go along for the ride. Once they're instantiated, they carry out their own simulation in world space, no longer locally. And the same thing too for the dust. So let me go to the dust and change its simulation space also to world. So now let's go ahead and press play, and we'll see what this looks like. Now we have all sorts of other problems, right? Because each one of those particles is now being simulated in world space, right? We realize we don't have enough particles to pull this off. So that's super strange looking. So let's go ahead and adjust that now. Now, one of the ways that I can this kind of sucks, right? Having to go and test it like this sucks. Because the only way that I can actually see how this thing is really looking is if I go and I do this. That's not great. So how can I improve upon that? Well, let me go ahead and move our projectile back into the view of the camera, like this, maybe here, maybe even here, so I get a full view of the tail. And then all I'll do is I'll just take the camera and I'll make it a child of the arcane projectile. And this way, as the projectile moves, it's taking the camera along for the ride, and so this way I can constantly see that trail. And this will give me the ability to test it a lot easier. Now, this next little trick here is going to save you a lot of time, but it'll take a little bit to get used to. So what would be very intuitive is if I could go in here and make modifications to this particle system, and if they would save in real time. So let's say I change the emission rate to 100 on this like smoke. And let's say that I think that looks good. Whenever I stop the simulation and I press play again, the emission rate gets reset to what it used to be. So here's a little trick. So if you run through this, let's say that we set this to 50 and we think that looks good, and we go and we make a bunch of other changes to this. Let's say that we make shape modifications and we decide that the radius of this is not great. We want it to be a tighter radius. Let's say we want to take the angle and broaden it up, or maybe even narrow it down so it's much more of like a, I don't know, like a stream like that. So we're basically just going through and making changes, right? Let's say I think that the lifespan is too long, so I'll change this to 0.5. It's starting to look weird. Right, so you go through here, you're fiddling with this, and you come up with something that you like or whatever. So what you can do is over here in the upper right hand corner, see there's this little gear? What you can do is you can copy the component. So then whenever you stop the simulation, it'll go back to playing how it used to. But before you do that, if you just go and click on that same gear, now that it's not playing, you can now have this option that is paste component value. So I'll go ahead and click paste component values. And what that will do is all of those component values that you saved will now get pasted in. This gives you the ability to edit your projectile or edit any attributes of a particle system while the game is running, and then not have to go and write down all of your values because it'll get deleted whenever you disable the simulation. All right. So let's go ahead and get down to seriously fixing this. So I'm going to make some pretty subtle modifications to it. Just, if you want, you can follow along. I'll try to be verbal as I'm going through this, but at this point, it's ultimately just up to you figuring out what you want this thing to look like, and what you think actually ends up looking good to you. So I'm just going to start messing around with values until I come up with something that I'm happy with. So I'm going to adjust the starting life so that the projectile has a tail that is something that I'm roughly happy with. So maybe something like that. But, you know, I'm not even confident that that's ever going to look good. And the reason for that is because of this texture sheet. The texture sheet is playing 64 frames, and I have it playing 64 frames over the course of this lifetime, this 0.5. I'm not sure if that'll ever look good, because that's just too much animation. And so now that I've got this whole thing moving, I'm wondering maybe what I want to do with this smoke instead is I want for it to have a spherical shape. I want for it to have a perhaps bigger radius. I want it to not be simulated in world space, because maybe I just want this to sort of complement that that central like sphere, like that the head of this projectile. So let me tone down that radius a lot, probably even more. Yeah, in fact, I just want that to be 0. Change the size of this to maybe 2. Trying to keep that center looking, you know, still really hot. The lifetime of these is still, it's a little long, but not perhaps overly long. Starting size, starting speed, let me set that to 0. Two. It looks like I have too many particles now. Change that to something like 10. So it's just a lot of fiddling with values, getting something that you're happy with. Maybe you want the size to be, even bigger, perhaps. I think that kind of looks good. Let me mess around with the colors for a bit. It's currently set to an alpha of 150% of the way through. Maybe I want to change that to 50. Yeah, so it's a little bit more subtle. Okay. Alright, I'll leave that as is and then move on. But before I do, let me go and just kind of take a peek at what's going on with the bloom real quick. Alright, so bloom needs some drastic adjustment. It's way too much. Take the radius down. Take the intensity down. Maybe. That's barely taking effect. Let's go to the dust, because that's kind of what's bugging me next. So here's our dust. Let's go ahead and adjust its color over lifetime. I'm going to take this and creep this forward. Yeah, I might actually not even need this this alpha of 0 fading in, just because it's kind of okay for the particles themselves to spawn like almost right at the beginning there. I think that's good. Go into emission. Crank this up so I get more of these guys. Go to the shape, and I'm going to change the radius down just a touch so that they're always seem to be stemming from the center here. I'm going to change the size over lifetime. This gives us like we have a graph editor, so I can go in here and say I want them to, you know, start at a certain size and then get small. And let me go ahead and change the starting size now to maybe like 0.5, not too much. I think that if I leave that as is, it might be a little bit too fast. Let's see. When I do get some sort of like smoke or trail in here, maybe it'll help clean that up. So I don't want to spend too much time manipulating those dudes, just because they actually might be okay. I might actually be going overboard with them right now, just because, you know, whenever I do add that trail, I'll have a lot of extra stuff that will be implying the direction that this thing is heading in. All right. So something I want to experiment with now is going to be a trail renderer, which is going to be an entirely new topic for us. Let me go ahead and find the head of this object. Just, you know, realizing now that the head is the hot part is actually facing upward, so I'm going to go ahead and rotate this to the side, kind of like our original plan, so it reads a little bit better going horizontally that way. And up here, I'm going to, actually, I'll do it over here in the side. I'm going to add a component. I'm going to add a trail renderer. I'm going to leave that as is, just all these default settings. I'm going to go ahead and press play, and we'll see how terrible this looks. Oh no, I didn't save the settings on the smoke. So let me go ahead and do that really quick. So this is going to be local space simulation. It's going to have a longer lifetime. Not that long. World space simulation, my bad. Actually, no, local space more. Local space, it's gonna have for shape. For starting speed, oh yeah, it needs to be a sphere, so it's kind of going in all directions like that. Starting speed's too much. Something like 2. Number of particles feels like a lot. And color, adjust this down to like 50, something like that. And this time I'll remember to go and copy component and paste component. All right, so let's get back to that trail renderer. So go back to the head of the ability, hit play. All right, so there's our trail renderer. Watch it go. I'm gonna go ahead and add, so a trail renderer, basically, let me hit pause real quick. A trail renderer, if I switch this over into a wireframe view, you can see that what it does is it generates a procedural mesh, just a bunch of triangles that are simply UV'd. And what happens is that as it travels, let me unpause, or let me, yeah, unpause. As it travels, it actually deletes the end parts, which makes it appropriate for building trails with. So let me adjust the trails material. So trail has a set of materials. We're currently using none, which is why it shows up pink like that. Let me go ahead and drag and drop in our dust material, just to see if we can reuse that. So here we go. Go ahead and press play and see what that's looking like. All right, it's looking kind of weird. And the reason why it's looking so weird, hit pause. The reason why that's looking so weird, go into our shaded view here, is because essentially what it does is it takes this entire shape that it's created, this whole thing, and it basically UVs out that whole thing as like one big old sheet. And since it does that, this whole shape is gonna get, you know, basically treated like one big old, one giant super stretched out texture. So let's go back into Photoshop. And we can actually just go and like rebuild this thing. So, you know, go grab my color more or less, or just do like that. And then what I'll do is I'll go and grab a brush, make it about 512, go more or less to the center, and we'll just draw a stripe straight through. Same exact technique as before. Go and change this up to like 300, more or less in the center, and then stripe straight through. As you guys are building this, you can do a cleaner job of it, and then even after we get it in there, we can adjust it some more. So I'm just going to call this my trail. So maybe arcane trail. And let's go ahead and get the arcane trail in here. So arcane trail's here. Let's go ahead and create a new material. It's our trail. Switch this over to particles additive. Get the trail in there, go back to our head, change the dust particle, or the dust material over to this new trail material, and let's hit play and see how that looks. Not too bad. Needs some adjusting, but nothing we can't do. So I'm going to just adjust all of this stuff live, kind of like I did last time. So the width of the tail is set to be 1. I actually want it to be thicker, right? Because I want it to encompass more of the shape. Now if I make it too large, it'll start to do something silly like that, and it'll become really obvious that I'm using a trail renderer. So there's definitely a sweet spot in terms of size that we're trying to hit here. So just fiddle with that. I'm going to maybe make it something like 3. I think that gives me a somewhat clean result. Then you can see that I have like access to this graph looking thing right here. And so this allows me to adjust the thickness, the width, to a maximum of whatever this value is set to. But you can actually right click anywhere you want in here and add a key. And so what I can do is I can actually taper this off so that the tail actually gets smaller as it goes. And currently, the trail is super, super long. So this can be adjusted by changing the time. What this time means is that each individual segment, so a segment is one of these little guys, like each quad that gets generated. So each one of those dudes is lasting 5 seconds before it gets deleted. So that's a long time. I'm going to change this to, let me change this to 1 maybe. 0.5, 1. something like that. The minimum vertex distance, this is this is actually like essentially like the resolution of this. So it describes how many of, like, if you can see that as I'm like sliding it, you can kind of see what's happening over here. This is basically determining the number of quads that I can have. And so you can think of this essentially as the resolution. And these trails, they're not a perfect solution. And the reason why they're not a perfect solution is that, you know, they don't generate perfect UVs, which gives you some of this, like, you know, strange looking jitteriness. And that's just sort of goes along with the territory. There's things that we can do to kind of clean that up and adjust that and make it not so evident. But we'll take a look at those in a little bit once we get this this shape a little bit closer to what we want it to look like. So let me just adjust this curve a little bit, because the trail doesn't need to be so dramatically long. So maybe something like that. And this is our first projectile, so it's not going to look amazing. Let me go ahead and copy these component values, uncheck that, and then let's go ahead and paste those component values back in. So paste component values. We can adjust some of our material properties so that we, you know, potentially clean this up a little bit more. Things like adjusting the opacity can help. But more or less, one of the major challenges is a lot of those jaggies that you see. They're not going to be super preventable. It just, you know, you can go in here and like fiddle around with some of these values, but you know, at the end of the day, because it's procedurally generated, we have very little control over those, and so if you need something that is of higher fidelity than what we are creating, there are better ways to go about putting it together. I just want to kind of demonstrate how a trail renderer sort of works, though. All right, let's draw our attention back over to the dust, because that's sort of what's bothering me at the moment. And so, let's see, size over lifetime. Let me adjust the size of these to begin with. So starting size is currently really small. Starting lifetime feels kind of long. Color over lifetime. Move that over so that they spawn a little bit quicker. Size feels kind of large now. Lifetime. I think that's probably good. We can do things like, you know, manipulate the shape, but I kind of want to, you know, treat this whole exercise today as just kind of exploration and fiddling around. Our goal isn't necessarily to make something gorgeous, it's just to kind of walk through the process of how you iteratively build something. I'm more or less happy with the current state of that, so I'm going to go and copy the component, shift play, and then go back in and paste those component values. Okay. All right, I kind of want to draw my attention back over to the smoke, and I'm sort of thinking that I'll need to introduce maybe some additional particle systems to kind of pull off the this overall effect I'm going for here. So I'm just going to kind of do a little bit more experimentation. So this smoke particle, currently simulated in world space. I'm wondering if I can go ahead and apply some sort of a force over lifetime, perhaps, to clean this up a bit, make it look like, because right now it almost looks really strange that these particles are just kind of hovering around. And I know I've gone back and forth on this. I'm just trying to find something that I think is a happy medium at this point. So let me go to our force over lifetime, check that, and let's see what happens if I apply a little bit of force. So X is currently pointing upwards. All right, so if I were to go negative with this, sort of have that backwards sweeping motion like that. I don't think I need like a whole lot of it though. Nothing too crazy. Just enough to kind of sweep back a little bit. Which direction is Z facing currently? Go back to force over lifetime. Where'd you go? So yeah, I think that's actually the direction I want things to head in. So something like that. It's looking a little better. Inch that forward just a little bit. Might have to do it while it's not moving. And maybe down a little bit so it's a little bit more centered. So yeah, it doesn't look too bad. That trail is really bugging though. I don't know if I don't really feel like fixing it though. Because I mean, trails are valuable. It's that taper that's really killing us. Because if we look, like every time it has to go and generate a new one of these segments, you can see that that's actually where it becomes jagged. And it just has to do with the fact that currently Unity's built-in system for handling trails is a little bit behind the rest of the industry. Sad to say, but true. There's other systems, but if you know for a fact that you want your trail to look a certain way, what you can do is simply go into Photoshop and you can just construct it that way, right? So you could just like go in here and you could just taper these off, like as you wish. You could just kind of like handle like your own like manual sort of taper like that. Like if I were to just go and save this out, and you know, this will just be like our alternate trail alt. I mean, trails are super good, they're super cool, but they don't always give you the end result that you're looking for. So this is my current trail. Let me go ahead and change this over to this new arcane trail that I constructed. Oh, first I gotta go and edit that material. So here, and change that over. And now I don't need to do all of that, that manipulation that I was doing. But actually, like, you know, I kind of forgot what I was doing. What actually, you know, I'm trying to do is to maybe not even use this trail renderer anymore. Maybe what I want to do is go back over to this head, duplicate it, and then I'll go ahead and apply the trail to that. And you know, of course, I got to go and clean this up. That looks gross. But if I were to go and just take this as like just a card, I have, you know, total control over the way that this dude looks. And he'll never get like all like skewed and stuff to the point like where the other one was. So I'd have to do some, some work to perhaps adjust some of the blending between these two. Or what I could even do is just make the two of these like the same image, right? And so in addition to just the projectile, I also include the trail into it. But you really don't know until you just go and do some exploration. Let me bring back the original trail. You don't know until you jump in and explore and see what's going to work for you. Because sometimes trails they're perfect. They're exactly what you need them to be. And sometimes they're not. A couple of other things I want to experiment with before we conclude for today. And again, our goal wasn't to make a perfect looking projectile. It's more or less to walk through the process of how you go and build one and experiment and explore. And so since we're in the spirit of exploring and experimenting and that sort of thing, I'd like for us to fiddle a little bit more with a couple of options that I think you might think are fun. So let's go to our dust. I'm going to hit play just so I can see what this looks like in motion. So if we go to our dust, if you have the newer version of Unity, if you click on noise, noise can give you the ability to do all sorts of really interesting stuff with making your particles feel like they're moving like very erratically. So like let me go ahead and, for instance, crank up this strength to, let's say, like 5 or something like that. So you can see that now these particles are kind of moving much more interestingly, right? They're, instead of moving uniformly like they are now, which is not so interesting to look at, if you go ahead and crank up the noise, provide some noise, here we can even crank up like the frequency, which will like, even more determine how erratic they're moving. Essentially what they're doing is they're moving based off of this procedural image that you're constructing by editing these values. And basically what you're doing as you're editing these values is you're kind of editing a height map, and this height map is basically feeding into these particles and determining how they are moving and how they should move. And so I'd recommend just going in here and kind of messing with these, but whenever you have something that like an ember that moves really erratically, instead of actually simulating wind that's supposed to be driving those dudes, I recommend that maybe you hop in here and start to fiddle around with these settings instead. So I kind of like what that noise is looking like, so I'm going to go copy that component and then paste that component. You can see now we get some of that really nice erratic motion. And I almost want to try the same thing for the smoke, perhaps. So we'll just go into the noise category. And maybe we'll do like the same thing. This might actually end up looking kind of weird just because smoke usually doesn't behave erratically. See how inorganic and how weird that sort of looks? As opposed to just like sort of like that nice, like, because what we have here is it's very obvious that this central point is kind of the emitter, and all of this stuff is just, all this like gas and smoke is just coming off of that central source. And so by enabling noise on that, we actually end up sort of defeating what that, we end up undermining that property, that quality. So not cool. So the last thing I want to experiment with, and then we'll just kind of stop there, is adding in one more, just like sort of like one more layer. And this is once again going to be based off of something that we did last week. So remember those ribbons, how we had this central object, and that central object would just sort of like rotate around? I've actually got the script for that somewhere in here, spinner. So let me go ahead and grab that spinner script because it's going to be useful for us. So let me go ahead and create, so here's the arcane projectile. Let me just double click on it, create an empty game object. So that empty game object is, I actually want to move this over to where the head is located. So move it to like, roughly thereabouts, more or less. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another particle system. I'm going to move it, let's say like right about here. I'm going to disable the shape on it for now. And you'll see what I'm about to do. I'm not going to fiddle with it too much. I'm going to make this new game object. I'm just going to call this pivot. And I'm going to attach the particle system to it. I'm going to make this now a child of the arcane projectile. So now the arcane projectile has this pivot, which has this particle system. On the pivot, I'm going to attach that spinner script. So we'll just go add component spinner. Spinner. Nope. There. Now, so the spinner, I might actually have to adjust this because the spinner is going to rotate, you can see like in that direction. So actually what I want to do is, let's go grab that spinner. Let me just get rid of this particle system until I'm ready for it. Here's the spinner. I want the spinner to be facing so that his Y is pointing that way, pointing in the same direction as the projectile itself. And that way, whenever he rotates, he'll be rotating around the Y-axis, so we'll go around this way. Now I'm ready for that particle system, so we'll go and create it. Effects, particle system, yay. So here. And put it like right about here maybe. And then I'm going to go and make it once again a child of that pivot. So now when I press play, what it's going to do, let me see if I can zoom in on this. So let me crank the speed up to like 5. So you can see that that's actually super weird looking. So it's flying around and it's spinning around that particle system as it goes, which is kind of cool, but it's also like super weird. Let's do a real quick change though. So instead of this being in local space, let me change this to world space. So let's run it now. Ooh, also let me go ahead and change the speed of it. So particle system, pivot, change this to 1. So we'll hit play. And so we change it to like 5. So you guys like see that? Like basically what it's doing is it's adding this nice extra little like spin that's like circling around like the central particle system, or like the central projectile. And I can do all sorts of really interesting things with this. Like, so for instance, if I were to change the shape of this so that maybe it's emitting as like no shape whatsoever. So maybe like so if I disable shape, it's just going to be emitting like in just like kind of like a straight line like this. Let me fiddle around with adjusting what renderer or what material it's using. So let me give it the dust material like this. I know all kinds of cool stuff like adjust the number of particles that are being emitted. Go do the color over lifetime adjustment that we always kind of seem to do. Maybe that's living a little bit too long. It always sounds terrible when I say that. This is living too long. But you can kind of see that we're able to create some really nice, interesting, spirally, cool looking shapes with this. living way too long though. So starting lifetime, set that to like something like 1. Yeah, super cool. And all that's just using that same technique that we used before. Like we didn't even have to edit that script at all. And now it adds that sort of like nice little complementary trail to it. I could go and do, I don't know, it's all just like a matter of like fiddling around with it and seeing what's good. See what you enjoy, what feels nice. There I go ahead and just add like a real quick like noise to it. And it's a little bit too intense. But just adding a lot of nice little interesting qualities to it. So you have so much stuff to play with. At any given time, there's, particle systems are super powerful, and they give you all kinds of opportunities to mess around with stuff. Projectiles are great. Projectiles are challenging because there are some atomic anatomic parts that you want to be aware of. Today, we did a really rough explanation on how we can emphasize the hottest part of a projectile, which is the business end. It's the most dangerous part. We talked about the concept of a trail renderer. Didn't get the best results out of it, but their trail renderers definitely have their uses, and hopefully we'll get a chance to explore those later. We created a lot of just sort of like secondary motion with these like almost like ember-like pixie dust particles that end up coming off of that central projectile itself. And we also did a lot of sort of like layering, similar to what we did with the first project. And this is actually a really small subset of what projectiles need. Projectiles need a casting phase. They need a projectile, the actual projectile itself. Then they need an impact. And so this is essentially only 1/3 of the work that's necessary to build out a fully fledged projectile. But hopefully this gets you guys thinking about particle systems and thinking more about them and thinking about how you can apply these to projectiles. So what I'd like you guys to do is to kind of do what you did last time. Take this particle system and take this projectile and just sort of run with it. Experiment with creating alternate versions of it. Try to make an icy looking particle system, or projectile rather. Try to make a fiery looking one. Get a little bit elemental with it. Don't stray too far from what we've done here, but do try to expand upon and explore these concepts. So how do you go about sharing this with me? I know that I said that I wanted you guys to show off the effects that you guys came up with. So let me show you what that process looks like. If you want to share an effect with anybody, what you want to do is go and first of all save your scene. So File, Save Scene, save it as whatever you want. I've called mine Projectile. Don't save your scene to any other folder structure. So when you hit like Save Scene, don't move it, just save it where it's at. Then what you do is you right click on the Assets folder like this. Then you click Export Package. It'll take it a little bit. And you just want to make sure that all the checkboxes are checked. This will send over the entire package to me. And then you click on Export. Save this file to wherever, so throw it on your desktop, and you can just call this, blah, 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 but whatever, the name that you want it to be. And then this file, whatever you end up saving with that file, is what you're going to send to me. And the place you're going to want to send it to is just email it to me for this first round. So that's going to be jfinley@lcad.edu. So cool, guys. That's it for projectiles, at least for this introductory phase of projectiles. Next time we meet, I'll be showing you guys a bit more about how you can construct better looking projectiles. We'll be talking about how you can go about structuring them so that there's a cast, so that there's an impact. It's going to require a little bit more code, a little bit more texture, and quite a bit more finesse. But hopefully this gets you guys started and get you guys inspired and excited. See you guys next time.